If this sounds like you, stay with me for a moment. Before I start, can I ask you something simple? How old are you, and where are you listening from right now? And if stories about family, quiet sacrifices, and moments that change everything hit close to home, you might want to subscribe, just so you don't miss the next part of this. I don't know who needs this story today, but I have a feeling it's someone who's learned how to smile while swallowing disappointment. Someone who shows up, even when they're slowly being erased. When I tell you this happened on my birthday, I need you to understand. It wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was the day I realized how invisible I'd become in my own family. Birthdays change when you get older. They stop being about balloons and wishes and start being about proof. Proof that you still matter. Proof that someone sees you. I told myself that year would be simple. I didn't want a party. I didn't want gifts. I just wanted my son to sit with me for a while. Maybe have cake. Maybe talk like we used to before life got loud and complicated and full of other priorities.
If this sounds like you, stay with me for a moment. Before I start, can I ask you something simple? How old are you, and where are you listening from right now? And if stories about family, quiet sacrifices, and moments that change everything hit close to home, you might want to subscribe, just so you don't miss the next part of this. I don't know who needs this story today, but I have a feeling it's someone who's learned how to smile while swallowing disappointment. Someone who shows up, even when they're slowly being erased. When I tell you this happened on my birthday, I need you to understand, it wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was the day I realized how invisible I'd become in my own family. Birthdays change when you get older. They stop being about balloons and wishes and start being about proof. Proof that you still matter. Proof that someone sees you. I told myself that year would be simple. I didn't want a party. I didn't want gifts. I just wanted my son to sit with me for a while. Maybe have cake. Maybe talk like we used to before life got loud and complicated and full of other priorities. I turned 64 that day. I remember because I woke up before my alarm, the way I always do now, staring at the ceiling and counting the small cracks above the fan. My house was quiet, too quiet. I made myself coffee and stood at the kitchen counter, holding the mug with both hands, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. I remember thinking, this is fine. This is what peace looks like. My son had married 3 months earlier, a small ceremony. I helped where I could, even though I was told, gently but firmly, that most things were already handled. His new wife was polite to me, always smiling, always proper, like someone who had learned the rules of kindness from a book instead of life. I told myself not to read into it. New marriages are delicate. I didn't want to be that mother. He had called the night before my birthday and said they'd come by in the afternoon, just for a bit. He said it casually, like it wasn't a big deal, which hurt more than if he'd sounded guilty. I cleaned the house anyway. Old habits don't die easily. I wiped counters that were already clean. I set out the good plates, then put them back, telling myself not to expect too much. Around 2, I heard the car pull up. I remember smoothing my shirt like I was the one being judged. When I opened the door, my son hugged me with one arm, distracted, already half turned back toward his wife. She stepped in, heels clicking on the floor I'd just mopped, holding a large gift bag. Bright, expensive looking. My heart lifted for just a second. We sat in the living room. Small talk filled the space, weather, traffic, work. The cake I bought sat untouched on the table. Then his wife stood up and said, "We actually wanted to give you something today. Or, well, explain something." My son didn't look at me when she said it. He looked at the floor. That should have been my first warning. She pulled out a folder from her bag. Thick, organized. She placed it on the coffee table like it was nothing, like she wasn't about to rearrange my understanding of my own life. She smiled and said, "We thought this would be meaningful, especially on your birthday." I waited. I remember nodding, like I was agreeing to something I hadn't heard yet. My son finally spoke. He said, "Mom, you know how you always said you wanted me to be secure, that you wanted me to build something stable." I said, "Yes, of course I did. What mother would?" He took a breath. "Well, we decided to move some things around, for the future, for my family." Then he slid the folder toward her and she opened it, turning it so I could see. Deeds, bank documents, legal language that felt cold and sharp. She explained it calmly, efficiently, like she was presenting a project at work. They had transferred everything. The savings accounts, the rental property, the land his father and I bought decades ago, all of it put under her name. For protection, she said, for simplicity, for their marriage. I didn't understand at first, my brain refused to catch up. I laughed softly and said, "I'm sorry, what?" My son finally looked at me then. His eyes were tired, defensive. He said, "It just makes sense, Mom, you don't really need all that anymore. And this way nothing gets complicated." On my birthday, sitting in the house I raised him in, hearing that I didn't need what I'd spent my life building. I felt something shift inside me, slow and deep like a shelf breaking behind a wall. I wanted to argue, I wanted to cry, but mostly I felt embarrassed, like I'd misunderstood my role, like I'd stayed too long in a story that had already moved on without me. I nodded again. That's what I did. I nodded and said, "If that's what you think is best." They stayed for maybe 20 more minutes, didn't touch the cake. His wife hugged me before they left and said, "Happy birthday, this is really for the best." When the door closed, I stood there longer than I should have. The house felt different, smaller, like it was no longer mine, even though my name was still on the mailbox. I sat down and stared at the folder they'd left behind, like it might explain something if I looked long enough. That night I didn't blow out any candles. I didn't make a wish. I just sat in the dark and realized that the gift I'd been given wasn't generosity, it was erasure. And that was only the beginning. If you want me to continue, just say continue, and I'll tell you what I did next, and why that decision changed everything. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept turning over in my mind what had happened. The quiet of the house felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me with the weight of every unspoken word, every overlooked dinner, every birthday when I'd smiled through disappointment. I felt small, invisible, replaced by someone polished and strategic, someone who had quietly claimed what I had spent a lifetime caring for. I thought about my son, my own child. I wanted to believe he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he thought he was doing the right thing, but the more I thought about it, the harder it was to separate intent from impact. Intent didn't matter when the outcome was this clear. I had been reduced to a spectator in my own life, and the person I had raised, the person I had taught kindness and respect, had turned his generosity toward someone else, someone new. By morning I was exhausted, but a strange clarity had settled over me. I realized I couldn't stay passive, not if I wanted to feel alive, not if I wanted to reclaim even a fraction of my dignity. I needed to make a decision, and fast. I started small. I called my lawyer, someone I'd trusted for years, someone who had handled all the property and estate matters for my family. I didn't speak much. I just asked for clarity. Was this even legal? Could my son simply hand everything over like that without consulting me? Could he override my wishes for the things I'd worked so hard to secure? The answers were complicated. Technically, a lot of it had been done legally. My name might still be on some of the documents, but the accounts had been changed. The properties were now legally hers. The money, the investments, it was all hers to manage. I felt dizzy listening to the explanation. My lifelong security, my work, my late husband's contributions, the things I had imagined passing down to my son, they were gone in one quiet, polite gesture, and there wasn't much I could do. I felt rage rise, sudden and bright, like a flame I hadn't realized had been smoldering inside me. But I also felt despair. How do you argue with someone who doesn't see you as necessary anymore? How do you fight for something that's been taken in the guise of care? I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to make him understand that birthdays weren't just dates, they were proof, markers of presence, of love, of attention. I wanted him to see me, but when I tried, my voice caught. I couldn't speak the anger I felt, not without shattering something fragile between us, something I wasn't sure could survive even a single loud word. So I did the only thing I could. I planned, quietly, deliberately. If they thought I was powerless, they were wrong. I began researching, calling contacts, digging into details that only someone who had lived through every family transaction could find. I learned about loopholes, options, and ways to make my presence undeniable, unavoidable. And then I acted, not recklessly, not out of spite, but with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. I found the one thing that no one had considered, the small detail buried in years of paperwork that still legally belonged to me. I used it strategically, slowly, like moving chess pieces across a board only I could see. The day I confronted them, it wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. I didn't scream or cry. I sat down at the table where they had sat on my birthday, placed my documents carefully between us and said, "There's something I need to show you, something you overlooked." I could see surprise flicker in both their eyes. My son, usually so composed, faltered. His wife's smile faltered too, that perfectly measured one she always used to soften edges. For the first time, I felt a shift in the power dynamic. For the first time, I realized I wasn't invisible. I wasn't replaceable. I told them what the documents meant. I explained the implications. The calm I had cultivated made my words sharper than any anger could have. And slowly, the chaos that had been quietly building inside me began to settle into something else, something I hadn't expected. A strange mix of triumph and sadness. I had reclaimed a part of my life, but the cost was clear. The trust, the unspoken bond with my son, was fractured, and maybe that couldn't be fixed. We didn't speak for weeks after that. When we did, it was polite, civil, but there was a new tension, a recognition that the balance of power had shifted. I had learned something essential, though painful. Respect isn't given freely. Sometimes it has to be demanded, not with anger, but with presence and certainty, with a refusal to vanish quietly. I started rebuilding, not just the tangible things, the accounts, the property, but myself. I began spending more time on my own interests, my own passions. I traveled slowly, carefully. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, and I started to understand something fundamental. Life doesn't wait for anyone. You can either be a silent observer or you can claim your space, no matter how uncomfortable it makes others. The chaos I had caused, my countergift, as some might call it, wasn't about revenge. It was about awakening, about showing that even when you're overlooked, even when the world assumes your value is diminished, you still exist, you still matter, and the way you assert that is often the only way anyone else will recognize it. I learned in those quiet weeks after the confrontation that anger is temporary, but clarity is permanent. You can let people redefine your life without permission, or you can step in and take it back on your own terms. And sometimes that means creating chaos, not to hurt but to survive. By the time the next birthday rolled around, I had changed. I didn't need validation from my son. I didn't need it from anyone. I had begun to see myself as enough. My gift to myself was no longer tied to their recognition. It was tied to my own awareness, my own ability to navigate betrayal, disappointment, and love without losing my voice. And that's when I understood the final, bitter truth. Family doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it challenges you in ways that feel cruel. But your response, your choices, your willingness to stand even when the world has shifted beneath your feet, that's the real measure of who you are. If you're still with me, I need you to hear this. Sometimes the people we love most, the people we dedicate our lives to, will hurt us in ways that feel permanent. But that pain doesn't have to define us. It can teach us, reshape us, and even free us. Now I have a question for you. When someone you love undermines you in the quietest, most polite way, do you let it go? Or do you fight for yourself, even if it means changing the relationship forever? If you want, I'll continue with the final part, the part where I rebuilt not just my life, but my soul, and learned the lesson that stayed with me long after the birthday chaos faded. I didn't hear from my son for almost a month after that meeting. No calls, no messages. At first I checked my phone too often, like it might ring if I stared hard enough. Then slowly something unexpected happened. I stopped checking. The silence, which once felt like punishment, started to feel like space. Painful space, yes, but also honest. During those weeks I began to notice how tired I had been for years. Not just physically, but emotionally. Tired of explaining myself, tired of shrinking to keep the peace, tired of being grateful for scraps of attention. I realized that for a long time I'd confused love with endurance. I thought loving my son meant accepting whatever role he assigned me, no matter how small. I started therapy. That alone felt like an act of rebellion. I sat across from a woman who didn't know my family, didn't care about their version of events, and asked me one simple question. When was the last time you felt chosen? I couldn't answer. That question followed me home. It sat with me while I cooked dinner for one. It followed me on my walks in the evening. It echoed in the quiet before sleep. I began to understand that the chaos I'd caused wasn't just legal or financial. It was emotional. I had disrupted a pattern where my needs were optional. Eventually my son did call. His voice sounded different, less certain, more guarded. He didn't apologize, not really. He said things like, "We didn't mean for it to feel that way, and you have to understand I'm married now," as if marriage automatically required my disappearance. I told him something I'd never said before. I said, "I understand you have a wife. What you don't understand is that I'm still a person." There was a long pause. I don't know what he felt in that moment. Relief, guilt, anger, maybe all of it. But for the first time I wasn't trying to manage his emotions. I let the silence exist. We didn't fix everything in that conversation. We didn't suddenly return to who we were before, but something shifted. Boundaries were spoken out loud, expectations were clarified, and I learned that reconciliation, when it's real, is slow and uncomfortable. It doesn't look like hugs and forgiveness, it looks like honesty that stings. Over time, I rebuilt my life in quiet ways. I downsized the house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I joined a book club. I took a solo trip I'd always postponed. I learned how to sit with myself without apologizing for taking up space. My relationship with my son is different now. We talk, we see each other, but I no longer center my existence around his approval. I don't chase closeness, I allow it when it's mutual. And strangely, that's when he started showing up more genuinely, not out of obligation but curiosity. As for his wife, we remain polite, cordial. I don't seek her validation and I don't offer mine freely. I've learned that respect doesn't require warmth, it requires clarity. Looking back, I see that birthday as the breaking point, but also the beginning. It forced me to confront a truth many parents avoid. Raising a child doesn't guarantee lifelong reverence. Love doesn't always come back in the shape you expect. But here's what I know now. Your worth does not decrease with age, your value is not transferable, and being someone's mother does not mean you stop being yourself. If there's one lesson I carry with me, it's this: never give someone the power to erase you quietly. Speak, act, choose yourself, even when it disrupts the story others are comfortable telling about you. And before I go, I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, even when it cost you your sense of self? If so, I hope this story reminds you that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, even if it creates chaos, especially then. There's one more part I haven't told you yet, not because it's dramatic but because it's quiet, and quiet truths are the hardest to admit. A few months after everything settled, after the documents, the conversations, the long silences, I had another birthday. This time I didn't tell anyone about it. No reminders, no expectations. I woke up early again, but the feeling was different. The house didn't feel empty, it felt intentional. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the morning light move slowly across the floor. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for my life to start again. I was already in it. My son texted later that day, just a simple message. "Happy birthday, Mom, hope you're doing well." No gifts, no visit. And strangely, it didn't hurt the way it would have before, because I wasn't measuring my worth by what showed up on that day anymore. That's when it finally hit me. The real chaos I'd created wasn't in their lives. It was in the old version of me that believed love meant self-erasure. That believed being needed was the same as being valued. I had dismantled that belief piece by piece, and it was uncomfortable, lonely, and necessary. I started saying no without explaining myself. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fix. I stopped offering emotional labor to people who hadn't asked for it or earned it. And every time I did, I felt a little more solid, like I was finally standing on my own feet instead of balancing on someone else's approval. My son and I still have moments, awkward ones, tender ones. Sometimes I see guilt in his eyes, sometimes defensiveness, but I don't rush to soothe either. I let him feel what he feels, just like I finally allow myself to feel what I feel without judgment. I don't hate him, I don't resent his wife. What I resent is the version of myself that thought love had to hurt to be real, that thought motherhood meant permanent sacrifice with no return. If you're listening to this and you're a parent, especially a mother, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to age without disappearing. You are allowed to protect what you've built. You are allowed to disappoint people who benefit from your silence. And if you're listening as someone's child, maybe this story makes you uncomfortable. Maybe it should, because one day roles reverse, and how you treat the people who gave you everything will echo back to you in ways you can't predict. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about money or property or legal rights. It was about presence, about choosing to exist fully, even when it's inconvenient to others, especially then. So here's my final question for you, one that matters more than anything else I've said. At this stage of your life, who are you living for, and what would happen if you chose yourself just once? Sit with that. Because sometimes, the most powerful gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop disappearing. There's something else that changed after all of this, and it's subtle enough that most people would miss it. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped planning what I'd say if someone misunderstood me, or how I'd soften my words so no one would feel uncomfortable. That constant inner noise finally went quiet. I didn't realize how much energy I'd spent managing other people's comfort until I stopped doing it. I began to trust myself in a way I never had before. Not the loud, confident kind of trust people post about online, but a steady one. The kind where you don't panic when someone is upset with you, where you don't rush to explain, justify, or apologize for existing, where you understand that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of being honest. My son and I eventually had one last conversation that mattered more than all the others. It wasn't planned. It happened over the phone late one evening. He sounded tired, worn down by life in a way that reminded me of his father. He said, "I didn't realize how much you did for me until you stopped." I didn't say anything right away, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something important. Growth doesn't always come with remorse. Sometimes it comes quietly after the damage is already done. I told him I didn't stop loving you, I just stopped disappearing. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself, he just said, "I know," and for the first time that felt like enough. We may never go back to what we were before, and that's okay. Some versions of relationships are only meant to last for certain seasons. Holding on to them past that point only creates resentment. Letting them evolve, even when it hurts, creates room for something more honest. Today my life is smaller in some ways, quieter, but it's fuller. I don't perform gratitude anymore, I feel it. I don't chase belonging, I build it where I'm respected. And when my birthday comes now, I don't wait to be celebrated. I celebrate myself, not with gifts or parties, but with presence, with peace, with the knowledge that I survived a moment that could have broken me, and instead it clarified me. So if you're listening to this and you feel overlooked, minimized, quietly pushed aside by people you once gave everything to, I want you to remember this. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need to earn respect through silence. And you don't owe anyone your disappearance. Sometimes choosing yourself will look like chaos to others. Let it, because the people who only loved you when you were convenient were never loving you fully to begin with. And I'll leave you with this, one last question, from one human being to another. If no one else changed, if no one apologized, if nothing went back to how it was, would you still choose to stop abandoning yourself? Think about that. Because the moment you answer yes, everything begins to change.